Can you solve all these diffusion questions? What is diffusion? Smart move. The spreading of particles is an accurate answer. Diffusion occurs in. Right choice. Liquids and gases is the best answer. Diffusion means to. Correct response. Spread is the most accurate answer. Diffusion mean to dash. You're right. Dash spread out is the correct answer. Diffusion is faster in. Exactly. Jess makes sense, and it is right choice. What does diffusion mean? Sharp thinking. Spreading is the right choice. Diffusion takes place within. Well picked. Gases and liquids is the correct answer. Diffusion can happen in dash. Well reasoned. Liquids and gases only is the correct choice. What is a synonym for spread? Well done. Diffusion is the right choice. Diffusion can be used in dash. Smart pick. Plants and animals is the correct choice. Diffusion moves along the dash. Perfect. Concentration gradient is the correct choice. What are phospholipids made of? Good thinking. Proteins is the right answer. Process which culture is spread. Good job. Your answer, cultural diffusion, works well here. Osmosis is the diffusion of dash. Nice selection. Water is the correct and valid answer. This process gets rid of wastes. Bravo. Exocytosis is the answer. What does diffusion not require? Great job. Energy is the accurate answer. Dash used in making solar cells. Nicely done. Solid diffusion is a solid answer. To surround or cover it completely. You chose engulfing, and it is correct. Diffusion is quicker, faster in dash. Valid point. Gases is true. Rate of diffusion is highest in dash. Excellent. Gases is a brilliant choice. 2 examples of passive transport are. Nice work. You chose diffusion and osmosis, and it is correct. What is another example of diffusion? Strong choice. Osmosis is the right answer. Diffusion is a form of a dash transport. Right again. Passive is a valid answer. One example of successful diffusion is clear logic. Your choice Apple iPod is sound and 100% true. The diffusion of water is known as dash. Excellent choice. Osmosis is the right answer. What type of transport requires energy? Solid response. Active transport is a valid choice. Which type of movement requires energy? Correct. Active transport is the right answer. Which of the following requires energy? Great thinking. Active transport is the right choice. What word means a follower or believer? You got it? Your choice adherent is right. In diffusion, particles move down a dash. On track. Concentration gradient is the correct answer. What company developed stable diffusion? Excellent choice. Stability A is the right answer. Gaseous exchange happens because of dash. On track. Diffusion is the correct answer. What are 3 different types of diffusion? You're right. Cultural, relocation, and expansion is the correct answer. The amount of particles in a given space. Nice selection. Concentration is the correct and valid answer. In diffusion, particles moves mixed together. Nice work. You chose yes, and it is correct. What promotes diffusion around the world? Well reasoned. Hierarchical diffusion is the correct choice. Water moved into or out of the carrots by. Correct response. Osmosis is the most accurate answer. Which of these is a barrier to diffusion? Great thinking. Rivers is the right choice. The random movement and mixing of particles. Perfect. Diffusion is the correct choice. The spread of ideas, practices, and products. Smart pick. Diffusion is the correct choice. App is required for which of the following? Clear logic. Your choice exocytosis is sound and 100% true. The act of moving from one place to another. Well done. Relocation is the right choice. How does diffusion occur on a global scale? Exactly. Through hierarchical diffusion makes sense, and it is right choice. What are 2 examples of passive transport? Solid response. Diffusion and osmosis is a valid choice. An example of cultural diffusion in Texas is. Well picked. Tex-Mex is the correct answer. What is the pressure at which osmosis stops? Good job. Your answer, Turga, works well here. A person who moves from one place to another. Right choice. Migrant is the best answer, which is not a daily phenomena of diffusion. Excellent. S is a brilliant choice. The virus is transmitted through the air by. Valid point. Diffusion is true. Moving particles while using a cell's energy. Correct. Active transport is the right answer. How does water move from one cell to another? Nicely done. Osmosis is a solid answer. Which energy is most related to gas diffusion? You got it. Your choice, kinetic energy, is right. Geographic area that has been shaped by people. Great job. Cultural landscape is the accurate answer. How many types of cultural diffusion are there? Right again. 4 is a valid answer. This is the simplest form of passive transport. Good thinking. Diffusion is the right answer. The larger the dash, the greater the diffusion. Sharp thinking. Area is the right choice. Diffusion happens very slowly in at all in dash. Strong choice. Solid is the right answer. What are some of the barriers of diffusion? You chose rivers, mountains, language, or religion. And it is correct. By which process does oxygen pass out of a leaf? Bravo. Diffusion is the answer. in which state of matter diffusion cannot happen. Smart move. Solid is an accurate answer. Osmosis is the diffusion of what pure substance? On track. Water is the correct answer. The term used to describe the diffusion of water. Strong choice. Osmosis is the right answer. Which of these is not a form of passive transport? Perfect. Endocytosis is the correct choice. An increase in temperature does what to diffusion? Smart pick. Speeds it up is the correct choice. Sharing and borrowing of ideas from other cultures. Nice work. You chose cultural diffusion and it is correct. Which means of particle transport requires energy? Solid response. Active transport is a valid choice. Diffusion helps create balance. A balance of what? Valid point. Concentration is true. For diffusion to work, animals must have dash skin. Nice selection. Moist is the correct and valid answer. Diffusion occurs fastest when the substance is dash. Correct. Hot is the right answer. Which type of transport requires an input of energy? Excellent. Active transport is a brilliant choice. Migration is an excellent example of dash diffusion. Great thinking. Relocation is the right choice. Water moving from areas of high to low concentration. Correct response. Osmosis is the most accurate answer. The spreading of something from one place to another. Right again. Diffusion is a valid answer. What is the legacy of the Silk Road? You chose cultural diffusion, and it is correct. How is oxygen released through the stomata of leaves? Excellent choice. Diffusion is the right answer. How does an increase in temperature affect diffusion? You're right. Diffusion speeds it up is the correct answer. Spread of cultural traits from one culture to another. Well reasoned. Cultural diffusion is the correct choice. Which of the following are forms of passive transport? Smart move. Diffusion osmosis is an accurate answer. Does facilitated diffusion require an input of energy? Bravo. No is the answer. The term osmosis refers to the diffusion of dash only. You got it. Your choice water is right. The type of cell transport where no energy is required. Great job. Passive transport is the accurate answer. Which type of transport can get rid of cellular wastes? Well done. Exocytosis is the right choice, which is the one state in which diffusion cannot occur. Nicely done. Solid is a solid answer. All the following speed up the rate of diffusion except sharp thinking. Large particles is the right choice. Give 2 factors that may affect the rate of diffusion. Clear logic. Your choice surface area and pressure is sound and 100% true. Just like Coke is a type of soda, dash is a type of dash. Right choice. Osmosis, diffusion is the best answer. The 4 main elements in diffusion are as follows except Exactly. Place makes sense, and it is right choice. Quick and widespread diffusion, like a disease, is known as. Good job. Your answer, contagious diffusion, works well here. A group of people who share a common culture and ancestry. Well picked. Ethnic group is the correct answer. Small polar molecules like O2 and CO2 enter a cell through. Good thinking. Diffusion is the right answer. The movement of molecules against a concentration gradient. Great job. Active transport is the accurate answer. The diffusion of water across a semi-permeable membrane is. Nice work. You chose osmosis, and it is correct. Which key term describes the random movement of particles? You're right. Brownian motion is the correct answer. What is the difference in concentration between two areas? Great thinking. Concentration gradient is the right choice. Which type of transport does require energy from the cell? You got it? Your choice active is right. In which state of matter diffusion takes place the fastest? Correct response. Gas is the most accurate answer. What is the part of the cell that allows diffusion called? Excellent. The cell membrane is a brilliant choice. Which variable improves the diffusion phenomenon in water? Exactly. High temperature makes sense, and it is right choice. Which of the following is not a type of passive transport? Perfect. Endocytosis is the correct choice. Passage of water across a selectively permeable membrane is. Excellent choice. Osmosis is the right answer. Diffusion and facilitated diffusion are both transport. Sharp thinking. Passive is the right choice. Which of the following is an example of cultural diffusion? Smart move. Baseball or clothing styles is an accurate answer. Which type of movement goes from low to high concentration? Valid point. Active transport is true. Which process is responsible for gas exchange in the lungs? Right again. Diffusion is a valid answer. The spread of cultural traits from one region to another is. Nicely done. Cultural diffusion is a solid answer. Facilitated diffusion moves the concentration gradient. Nice selection. Down is the correct and valid answer. Which of the following is not a form of expansion diffusion? Well done. Relocation is the right choice. This example of passive transport is the diffusion of water. You chose osmosis, and it is correct. Which of these factors does not affect the rate of diffusion? Bravo! Dynamic equilibrium is the answer. What type of diffusion spread Judaism? Strong choice. Relocation diffusion is the right answer. The restriction of a culture from outside cultural influences. On track. Cultural divergence is the correct answer. Osmosis is always the movement of molecules. Smart pick. Water is the correct choice. Cultural diffusion is the spread of cultural to another. Well reasoned. Elements is the correct choice. Which process moves molecules from low to high concentration. Well picked. Active transport is the correct answer. The diffusion of water across a selectively membrane is called. Good thinking. Osmosis is the right answer. What type of active transport does waste move out of the cell? Right choice. Exocytosis is the best answer. Means the number of particles of a substance present in an area. Correct. Concentration is the right answer. The greater the surface area, the faster the rate of diffusion. Clear logic. Your choice true is sound and 100% true. Which of the following types of diffusion spreads the quickest? Solid response. Contagious diffusion is a valid choice. Dash is the amount of a given substance contained in a solution. Good job. Your answer concentration works well here. Which of the following doesn't influence the rate of diffusion? Exactly. Type of cell involved makes sense, and it is right choice. Which type of molecules would be transported by simple diffusion? Strong choice. Small, nonpolar is the right answer. What happens to the rate of diffusion when temperature increases? You chose increases, and it is correct. The difference in the concentration of molecules across a distance. Excellent. Concentration gradient is a brilliant choice. The alveoli walls are folded to increase the rate of diffusion by. Well reasoned. Increasing SUS the correct choice. Which of the following is not a common untopic on norm diffusion? Valid point. Universal currency is true. What is the following an example of Chinatown located in New York? Smart move. Cultural diffusion is an accurate answer. An evidence that proves that particles are in random motion is dash. Well picked. Brownian's motion is the correct answer. Which type of cellular movement requires the input of energy? Correct. Active transport is the right answer. Which of these molecules is not likely to enter a cell by diffusion? Right choice. A protein is the best answer. The breaking down of sugar with oxygen to make energy is called dash. Nice work. You chose cellular respiration, and it is correct. Dust particles seen dancing in a beam of light is an example of dash. You got it. Your choice Brownian's motion is right. What is the name of the process responsible for the spread of smell? Right again. Diffusion is a valid answer. Which gases move into and out of the blood at the lungs by diffusion? Smart pick. Oxygen and carbon dioxide is the correct choice. What model assumes that states learn about programs from each other? Excellent choice. National interaction is the right answer. Which type of passive transport uses the help of a transport protein? Nicely done. Facilitated diffusion is a solid answer. How do carbon dioxide and oxygen move in and out of a mesophyll cell? Sharp thinking. Diffusion is the right choice. What is the name of the membranes that allow diffusion to take place? Perfect. Exchange surfaces is the correct choice. The natural spreading of particles through a liquid or gas is called. Good job. Your answer, diffusion, works well here. Dash is the movement of any substance from high to low concentration. Nice selection. Diffusion is the correct and valid answer. Occurs when the cell uses energy to engulf or take in large particles. Great job. Endocytosis is the accurate answer. When there is an unequal concentration of something, it will create a... Good thinking. Concentration gradient is the right answer. What type of diffusion is represented by McDonald's spread worldwide? Bravo! Stimulus diffusion is the answer. The movement of water through a semi-permeable membrane is called dash. Great thinking. Osmosis is the right choice. How does the rate of diffusion change with the decreases in temperature? Correct response. Slower is the most accurate answer. What is the term to describe maintaining internal balance in the cell? Well done. Homeostasis is the right choice. Which process describes how large particles are removed from the cell? Solid response. Exocytosis is a valid choice. Membranes that only allow certain molecules to enter or exit the cell. On track. Selectively permeable is the correct answer. Driving force for diffusion is not based on the concentration gradient. You're right. Incorrect is the correct answer. Diffusion is the movement of particles in a substance from an area of. Clear logic. Your choice, high to low concentration, is sound and 100% true. Gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide move across the cell membranes by. Correct response. Facilitated diffusion is the most accurate answer. The lungs have millions of alveoli to increase the rate of diffusion by. Perfect. Increasing Sa is the correct choice. When you perceive a strange smell around you, diffusion is taking place. Well picked. Yes is the correct answer. Diffusion allows the movement of particles without having to use any dash. Nice selection. Energy is the correct and valid answer. Osmosis is the diffusion of dash across a selectively permeable membrane. Clear logic. Your choice, water, is sound and 100% true. Chinatown in New York City would be an example of what type of diffusion? Bravo, relocation is the answer. We get the smell of hot food in the kitchen outside the house because of? Strong choice. Diffusion is the right answer. Cultural diffusion is the process of dash, moving from one place to another. You're right. Customs or ideas is the correct answer. When cultural traits spread to another region, that spread is known as dash. Exactly. Cultural diffusion makes sense, and it is right choice. Which of the following can increase the rate of diffusion across a membrane? Good thinking. Non-polar molecules is the right answer. If oxygen diffuses in 20 seconds, what might be the diffusion time of helium? Nice work. You chose 7 seconds, and it is correct. Dash is moving molecules across the cell membrane without using energy. Good job. Your answer, diffusion, works well here. When the smell of perfume spreads throughout a room, it is an example of dash.
Well done. Diffusion is the right choice.
Which route is not a traditional method of cultural diffusion in early times?
Correct. Mass media is the right answer.
The relatively constant internal physical conditions of an organism is called
Sharp thinking. Homeostasis is the right choice.
What is the diffusion of water only across a cell or semi-permeable membrane?
Right choice. Osmosis is the best answer.
Shared practices, technologies, attitudes, behaviors transmitted by a society.
Right again. Culture is a valid answer.
How does oxygen move from an alveolus to a surrounding capillary in the lungs? You got it. Your choice by diffusion is right. Occurs when numerous places or people near the point of origin become adopters. Nicely done. Contagious diffusion is a solid answer. How do small molecules like oxygen and carbon dioxide cross the cell membrane? Valid point. Simple diffusion is true. The beliefs, goals, and practices that a group of people share is known as its on track. Culture is the correct answer. What is the term for the spread of cultural elements from one place to another? Well reasoned. Diffusion is the correct choice. Diffusion has been introduced to the students when they are in lower secondary. Great thinking. W is the right choice. The spread of ideas, inventions, or patterns of behavior to different societies. Great job. Stimulus diffusion is the accurate answer. What is the following an example of McDonald's having stores all over the world? Smart move. Expansion diffusion is an accurate answer. Moving from areas of low concentration to areas of high concentration is called. You chose active transport, and it is correct. The movement of particles from high concentration to low concentration is called. Excellent. Diffusion is a brilliant choice. Movement of molecules from low concentration to high concentration is called dash. Smart pick. Active transport is the correct choice. Cells use energy to move materials across a membrane. Excellent choice. Active transport is the right answer. When a molecule enters a cell via the proteins on its membrane, it has undergone. Solid response. Facilitated diffusion is a valid choice. Equal concentration of molecules on both sides of a membrane is also known as dash. Well reasoned. Equilibrium is the correct choice. The process by which a solid turns into a gas, skipping the liquid phase, is called. You chose sublimation, and it is correct. The movement of particles from an area of high to low concentration is called dash. Perfect. Diffusion is the correct choice. Dash, which is the diffusion of water and is an example of facilitated diffusion. Well picked. Osmosis is the correct answer. McDonald's changing their menu to adapt to different cultures is an example of what? Sharp thinking. Stimulus diffusion is the right choice. Mormons moving from Illinois to Utah would be an example of what type of diffusion? Good job. Your answer relocation works well here. Dash is the movement of molecules from higher concentration to lower concentration. Excellent choice. Diffusion is the right answer.
Product life cycle describes the product's development and lifespan in the market.
Smart pick. Plessy is the correct choice.
Facilitated diffusion requires dash that help materials get in and out of the cell.
Excellent. Proteins is a brilliant choice. What method of diffusion is most appropriate in describing how cholera got to Haiti? Right choice. Relocation is the best answer.
What is another way to say when ideas and products spread from one place to another? You got it. Your choice, diffusion, is right.
What are two molecules that move easily across the cell membrane by simple diffusion? Well done. Oxygen and carbon dioxide is the right choice.
This is an idea or innovation that spreads based on its attachment to another concept.
Valid point. Stimulus diffusion is true. The way in which an innovation spreads and propagates over a specific period of time. Bravo. Diffusion is the answer. When the movement of molecules go against the concentration gradient, this is called smart move. Active transport is an accurate answer. The random motion of a particle as a result of collisions with surrounding molecules. Exactly. Brownian motion makes sense and it is right choice.
When cells form a vesicle to take in materials, which form of transport is occurring?
Great job. Endocytosis is the accurate answer. This is a negative when it comes to diffusion. But disease is what type of diffusion? Nice selection. Contagious is the correct and valid answer.
What is the following an example of a family moves from Ethiopia to the United States?
Good thinking. Relocation diffusion is the right answer. The absorption of food molecules by the cells of the small intestine is an example of. Nicely done. Diffusion is a solid answer. The capillaries and ventilation increases rate of diffusion by. Solid response. Increasing concentration gradient is a valid choice. Molecules tend to move from an area of high concentration to low concentration is called. On track. Diffusion is the correct answer.
The lungs are adapted for diffusion by the walls of the alveoli being 1 cell thick too.
Correct response. Decreased diffusion distance is the most accurate answer. When the tonic T is the same either side of a membrane, we refer to this a reaching dash. You're right. Dash equilibrium is the correct answer. Diffusion is considered a type of dash transport because it does not require any energy. Great thinking. Passive is the right choice. The dash, the concentration gradient between two regions, the dash, the rate of diffusion. Right again. Larger, faster is a valid answer. Facilitated diffusion, when large molecules move across a membrane via the help from dash. Clear logic? Your choice channel proteins is sound and 100% true.
The taking or borrowing of ideas, customs, and social behaviors from another culture is
strong choice. Cultural diffusion is the right answer. Brands like McDonald's, Starbucks, and Nike appearing all over the world is an example of. Correct. Cultural diffusion is the right answer.
Which of the following factors does not have a direct influence on the rate of diffusion?
Nice work. You chose color and it is correct.
Which of the following phenomena takes place when we add a drop of Dettol into the water?
Good job. Your answer diffusion works well here. Dash is the free movement of particles across the membrane with the concentration gradient.
Excellent choice. Diffusion is the right answer.
Diffusion is the movement of dash from an area of high concentration to low concentration.
Great job. Solutes is the accurate answer. What is the process that causes a liquid to pass through a selectively permeable membrane? Nice selection. Osmosis is the correct and valid answer. The spreading of molecules from higher concentration to lower concentration is called dash. Smart move. Diffusion is an accurate answer. What is the movement of particles with the concentration gradient using protein helpers?
Clear logic. Your choice facilitated diffusion is sound and 100% true.
The time evolution of the density in a system with drift and diffusion is described by the
Smart pick. Einstein-Smoluchowski equation is the correct choice.
Which type of passive transport uses proteins to help molecules pass through the membrane?
Strong choice. Facilitated diffusion is the right answer. What is the difference between simple diffusion and facilitated diffusion? Facilitated dash. Well reasoned. Uses protein channels is the correct choice.
As we decrease the surface area to volume ratio, what are we doing to the rate of diffusion?
On track. Decreasing is the correct answer.
How does a body cell get oxygen across the cell membrane into its cytoplasm for respiration? Correct response. By diffusion is the most accurate answer. From fastest to slowest rate of diffusion, which of the following is in the correct sequence? Well picked. Gases, liquids, solids is the correct answer. Facilitated diffusion needs what to get particles from one side of the membrane to the other. Solid response. A transmembrane protein is a valid choice. What is the following an example of COVID-19 spreading throughout the world for Wuhan, China?
Nice work. You chose expansion diffusion, and it is correct.
Which type of movement has channels that help large molecules move through the cell membrane? Right choice. Facilitated diffusion is the best answer. The difference in the concentration of a substance from one location to another is called an.
You got it. Your choice concentration gradient is right.
Which of the following is another possible word for concentration in the context of diffusion?
Nicely done. Amount is a solid answer.
Facilitated diffusion is the diffusion of solutes through transport, dash, in the cell membrane. Right again. Proteins is a valid answer. What is the process of moving water from high to low concentrations through the cell membrane?
Well done. Osmosis is the right choice.
What is the following an example of a French woman moves to Spain to start a new job in life?
Exactly. Relocation diffusion makes sense, and it is right choice.
What is the result of particles spreading evenly in gases, solutions, and mixtures of liquids? Excellent. Equilibrium is a brilliant choice. Vocabulary: the movement of materials across a cell membrane using cellular energy is called dash. You're right. Active transport is the correct answer. The movement of substances across a cell membrane requiring the use of energy. Great thinking. Active transport is the right choice. When substances move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, this is sharp thinking. Diffusion is the right choice.
What type of passive transport moves water molecules from high concentration to low concentration?
You chose osmosis, and it is correct. Vocabulary: the diffusion of water molecules across a selectively permeable membrane is called dash. Valid point. Osmosis is true. Whip Nay Nay, Harlem Shake, or Ice Bucket Challenge videos are examples of what type of diffusion? Bravo! Contagious diffusion is the answer. The diffusion of particles through the cell membrane from high to low concentration is called dash. Correct. Passive transport is the right answer. Which one is not an example of a physical feature that prevented or slowed down cultural diffusion? Perfect. The Silk Road is the correct choice. Which concept refers to the ease of connecting with different people and cultures around the world?
Good thinking. Time-space convergence is the right answer.
When you take a painkiller for a toothache, how does it reach your cells? Ooh. Right again. Diffusion is a valid answer. Fashion spreading from social elites to the rest of society is an example of what type of diffusion? Nice work. You chose hierarchical, and it is correct. Culture spreading of one country, forcing their language and tradition to another is diffusion through. Great thinking. Conquest is the right choice. Culture spreading through modern technology like radio, television, and internet is diffusion through. Great job. Technology is the accurate answer. The term used to describe when some molecules are able to pass through a membrane and others are not. Good job. Your answer: selective permeability works well here. The movement of water across a selectively permeable membrane without the use of any energy is called. Correct. Osmosis is the right answer. The capillary walls being one cell thick and close to the alveoli increases the rate of diffusion by. Nicely done. Decreasing diffusion distance is a solid answer.
When particles move from areas of high concentration to areas less concentrated, this has taken place.
Well done. Diffusion is the right choice.
Which of the following allows movement of water vapor from air spaces in the leaf to the environment?
Smart pick. Diffusion is the correct choice. This is an idea or innovation that spreads based on person-to-person contact within a given population. Smart move. Contagious diffusion is an accurate answer. Molecules will move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration until they reach. Clear logic. Your choice: equilibrium is sound and 100% true.
water will move across the membrane until dash is reached. When this happens, the two solutions are dash.
Bravo. Equilibrium. Equal is the answer.
What is the following an example of the French language being spoken in a lot of family in New Orleans?
You're right. Cultural diffusion is the correct answer. Movement of materials from an area of low concentration to an area of higher concentration using energy. Excellent choice. Active transport is the right answer.
Diffusion is the dash movement of particles freely in all directions to occupy the whole space available.
Excellent. Constant random is a brilliant choice.
Potassium is needed in higher concentrations within the cell than outside the cell. How is this possible? Well picked. Active transport is the correct answer. What is it called when molecules move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration? Solid response. Diffusion is a valid choice. What is the following an example of the Japanese food sushi is now an extremely popular food in the US? Correct response. Cultural diffusion is the most accurate answer.
Small, non-polar molecules like CO2 and O2 can pass through the cell membrane using what type of transport?
You got it. Your choice diffusion is right.
Which is not a device used in gas diffusion experiments, according to the principles of miniature chemistry. On track. Pink-shaped bottle is the correct answer. Involves the actual movement of the original adopters from their point of origin or hearth to a new place.
Well reasoned. Relocation diffusion is the correct choice.
The process where only water is allowed to pass through the cell membrane from a high to low concentration.
Nice selection. Osmosis is the correct and valid answer. Which molecules would be moved from a high concentration to a low concentration using facilitated diffusion?
Sharp thinking. Sodium is the right choice. The movement of atoms, ions, or molecules from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Valid point. Diffusion is true. What is the following an example of the migration of Christianity with European settlers who came to America? You chose relocation diffusion, and it is correct.
What factor can affect the rate of diffusion by increasing the difference between high and low concentrations?
Strong choice. Increasing concentration gradient is the right answer.
The movement of a substance across a membrane against its concentration gradient requires energy and is called.
Exactly. Active transport makes sense, and it is right choice. Bleach spilled on the kitchen floor, and after some time, whole kitchen smelled of bleach. Which process occurred? Perfect. Evaporation and diffusion is the correct choice. Diffusion is the free movement of particles from an area of dash concentration to an area of dash concentration. Right choice. High to low is the best answer. Yum! Something smells good. The neighbors are cooking on the grill. Is this diffusion, osmosis, or active transport? Good thinking. Diffusion is the right answer.
A design that becomes common over a longer period of time, for example due to standardization or societal decisions.
Exactly.
Dominant design makes sense and it is right choice. Move substances across through embedded proteins from areas of higher concentration to areas of lower concentration. You're right. Facilitated diffusion is the correct answer. A period where different designs are tested and where companies compete against each other to become the market leader. Perfect. Fermentation epoch is the correct choice. Choose the correct option. Sharp thinking. Diffusion is the right choice. Immigrants who move from their homeland because of war, political instability, persecutions, or natural disaster are called. Bravo! Refugees is the answer. Diffusion can only occur in dash. Right choice. Liquids and gases is the best answer. The picture below is an example of dash. Great job. Simple diffusion is the accurate answer. The phenomenon whereby the introduction of new transportation technologies progressively reduce the time it takes to travel between places. Smart move. Time-space convergence is an accurate answer.
In the picture, the blue region represents dash.
Excellent. Solvent is a brilliant choice. An increase in temperature does what to diffusion? Well reasoned. Speeds it up is the correct choice. Which diagram best shows the end result of diffusion? Great thinking. J is the right choice. Who is the author of Diffusion of Innovation textbook? Nice work. You chose Everett M. Rogers, and it is correct.
The second picture of blood cells are dash to its environment.
Nice selection. Isotonic is the correct and valid answer. Is the food dye moving an example of osmosis or diffusion? Excellent choice. Diffusion is the right answer.
When the diffusion process is complete, the particles dash.
Strong choice. Continue to move is the right answer. What type of transport is occurring in part of the diagram? You got it. Your choice diffusion is right. Which of the following is not a cause of cultural diffusion? Valid point. Censorship is true. Celeb Gigi had it promoting an item is what type of diffusion? Right again. Hierarchical diffusion is a valid answer. The main way that cultural diffusion happened in East Asia was. Well picked. Trade is the correct answer. Mindy got strep throat and spread it to half of her classmates. Solid response. Contagious diffusion is a valid choice. The type of transport that requires the use of transport proteins. Good job. Your answer facilitated diffusion works well here.
Diffusion of Zika virus is an example of which type of diffusion?
You chose contagious, and it is correct. In this image, the cell is using which type of molecular transport? A. Correct. Endocytosis is the right answer. What type of diffusion is this? Pick the single meaning best option. Good thinking. Expansion diffusion is the right answer. TikTok influenced the return of 90s fashion. This is an example of. Correct response. Hierarchical diffusion is the most accurate answer. A center where cultures developed and from which ideas spread outward.
Nicely done. Culture hearth is a solid answer.
Coronavirus has spread as people come in contact with infected people.
On track. Contagious diffusion is the correct answer.
Which type of passive transport is being represented in this picture?
Smart pick. Facilitated diffusion is the correct choice. What type of cultural diffusion is best exemplified by the description?
Clear logic. Your choice stimulus is sound and 100% true.
Molecules from inside the cell being expelled out of the cell is known as.
Well done. Exocytosis is the right choice. How you will get all these quiz questions in PDF books format?
Smart pick. Contact Narayan Changda is the correct choice